Woo. Mm, mm, mm. Woo. What's up, everybody? Welcome to the most random thing I've ever done in my entire life. Ultimate spur of the moment. Yeah. So, what's up, everybody? Gonna be chatting about some Welcome to the most random thing I've ever done in my entire. Turn that off. Yeah. So, anybody's joining this? I study a lot of stress, right? So, like, if I had my choice in the world, I would probably just do this for fun and read all about this stuff and post about it. And I don't know, this world is really interesting to me. So I get a lot of DMs about like people who want to read some of the articles that I'm reading and hear about some of the geekier side and not just about the stuff that I do in sports or gymnastics. So I figured it'd be fun to share some of the articles that I read and some of the stuff I find interesting. And then I don't know, just kind of think out loud like some of the stuff I've written about and how I apply it to athletes that I work with or some of the things that I think are useful, right? So working as a gymnastics coach, working as a researcher, working as um, someone who treats in medicine, like stress is a big deal. And I think the more that I study it, the more I found out that stress is kind of like the over umbrella, right? So I think there's physical stress, there's like injuries, right? People think about that. And there's like mental stress. People have like mental health issues, stuff like that. It's pretty popular right now. I think stress is the umbrella of stress is a big deal. And I think that like some of the stuff and the research is really cool. So um, for those that are interested, right, there's like probably like two other people on watching the live stream who care about this stuff as much as I do. But I think it'd be good content for people. Probably try to help people understand some of the stuff. And so I think some of the papers that are in here are really interesting that I'll share, and then also that some of the ideas that you can apply to it are super interesting for yourself, right? Or as you know, if you work with athletes, if you coach, if you're a medical provider, whatever it is. So it's interesting because the world of stress like evolved to really talk about how it's all about, like the optimal dose, right? So there's like too much of a good thing can kill you, and that's where I kind of like got interested in this kind of stuff. Is like it's all about the optimal dose, right? It's about what's the. I'm going to share my screen real quick so I can toss up some of this stuff. So it's like all about like what's the optimal dose of some of these things, and I kind of like put this one up first because I think this paper is super interesting. This was from let me zoom up here. Bruce McEwen, who recently passed away, sadly. Um, he had a lot of the research along with Robert Sapolsky, who I think a lot of people really know understand well. But this kind of research world for me evolved out of like looking at all the different things that people can do it, right? There's like the basics of stress, which is like you can have like a stressful workout, you can have a stressful, I don't know, you can have a stressful day, whatever it is. And but like a lot of different things contribute to stress. And I think that's what's so interesting about, us as humans is like there's the old school model of stress was more about like if you look at how we're designed, it's a short up and a short down. Like we're made for like acute bouts of stress, right? We're made for like very quickly, like something pops out at you, scares you, and like you ramp up, your blood pressure goes up, your heart rate goes up, stuff like that. And it's a good thing, right? Short-term stress enhances memory, and it also like helps out with some of the cognitive function. It's a good thing. And it's adaptive, but if it's too much, like I think they say, like if you have chronic activation over a long period of time, or if you also have somewhat of like a constant up and it never shuts down, right? There's no ramp down cycle. That's where things become problematic. And so that's how I got interested into it first was just seeing like, in myself and in other people who just kind of get burnt out, right? Is one of the manifestations they say like emotional exhaustion and stuff like that, but injuries and things like that. And it's all like in one shape or form, it's the same stuff. So I don't know. I just thought it was really curious that like a lot of this research was coming out from Robert Sapolsky, Bruce McEwen. I think David Gray is also there at Rockefeller University and some other people. And so it was super interesting to hear about what they were talking about with this kind of stuff as it relates to other topics. And I thought it was super relevant in some of the stuff that was going on in my physical therapy world, but also with coaching. And so the basics of it are like, there's like, I think I'll pull this one up here. These are from notes that I did at a lecture, but it's really all about like the optimal dose, right? So like trying to figure out, this is not from Bruce McEwen, but this is from, I think a strength conditioning textbook, but it's all about like the optimal dose of load and recovery. And so if people have that acute stressor, it's good and they can build up tolerance. But if they don't, it can kind of wear them down over time. And I think that's where you see people kind of fall apart down into the red zone. And then what you're trying to do is adapt, right, to some way, shape, or form to increase the capacity like this. So there's like a few, I think a lot of people have the basics of where this research came from, which is homeostasis, right? Which is like, maintaining a balance, right? They have like this set point, this window of too much, too little. And like your body kind of adapts like pH or temperature or, your blood pressure and stuff like that. It kind of keeps you in a narrow window. But I think that has evolved now to become this kind of idea of allostasis, which is, I think I heard a lot from Bruce McEwen was the first one, but that like your body has an adaptive set point, but it's constantly changing based on the environment and based on the conditions. So um, allostasis is more like that stability through change, like dynamic processes, right? So you're trying to like cope with something, you're coping with a stressor, but you're constantly trying to hit a moving target, I guess, so to speak. And so the allostasis is where things started to become interesting because the process of actually having a stress response can be damaging on your body. Like the activation of stress responses, the actual ability to get through and take care of the stressor is hard. So I think that's where it came through. Some of the stuff is interesting, but is interesting that like you can have an anticipatory component. So like you can think about these things in advance. I think like it's interesting that humans are one of the only people that can consciously recruit a stress response by thinking about stuff. So you think about like a hard workout you have coming up, a big presentation, or like you reflect back on something that was really hard, you can actually recruit the same stress response that you would have. You were getting like chased by someone, or if you had somebody jump out and scare you or something like that. So that's what they say. Like, a lot of research says makes humans so different than a lot of other animals is like that we can consciously predict our own stress response. And I think that's where it gets really interesting in terms of like, traffic and job stress and work stress and stuff like that. I think a lot of people develop the wear and tear in the system because of that. And so I see a lot in athletes that I work with who overtrain quite a bit and they get burnt out, right? They call that non-functional overreaching if they kind of push the needle too hard into the red zone for too long. So that's like, chronic wear and tear from just repetitively activating a stress response. But then there's also stuff that can happen more on the mental health side, which I think a lot of athletes deal with too, which is just like burnout, loss of training effect. Like that is the same system that, is being recruited over and over again, whether you're talking about a hard workout or stressed out to stand in front of a presentation or personal life stress, whatever it is, financial stress, whatever it is, you're kind of recruiting the same response over and over. So like that universal nature of a stress response is really interesting to me. And I think that it has a lot of carryover for anybody, how I work with like, athletes that I treat or think about my own personal life and stuff like that. So like that concept of allostasis was the first thing to kind of come out of the newer research. I think it's this book. I want to say I can show this book. But this was one of the first books that I read. I hope this isn't backwards for the camera here. But this is one of the first books that I read was Jay Shulk's book. So Allostasis, Homeostasis, and the Cost of Physiological Adaptation. This book is really good going through like some of the basics. I think this was published in here. I want to say it was like 2004. Holy moly. That's a long time ago. I did not know 2004. But clearly I was behind the research. But I read this and it was like a really, really interesting read on, how people can or cannot adapt. And so if you're looking for something to read, that's a really good one. But that process kind of got evolved into the literature. And like, I think that now where things are really getting interesting is there's some ideas related to, let's go this way. Yeah. So now we have concepts like allostatic load. I'll start there. And that's like, so every time you recruit the stress response over and over again, right? Whether that's a workout, whether that's like a hard thing you're doing or whatever it is, you get wear and tear in the system. And I think it's where the wear and tear of like actually activating the system is one thing to think about, but the end product of the actual stress response can be damaging, right? So cortisol and glucocorticoids are good in short doses, but when you look at the research, especially in like the hippocampus and prefrontal cortex and stuff like that, the long-term exposure of yourself to cortisol has negative effects on your body. So I think it was Robert Sapolsky that started doing the really well-known research in rats, which is now evolved into like some more current stuff with his book, Why Zebras Don't Get Ulcers. But the learning potential for the short term is good when you have glucocorticoids and acute stressors. But then in the long term, it starts to deteriorate your ability to have long-term memory function and some other stuff. Like a lot of other areas of your brain are negatively impacted by chronic activation of the stress system, right? And so there's a kind of step-by-step process that I'll chat with people about, but the end of the HPA axis system is cortisol, whereas the end of more the autonomic and kind of SAM system is more adrenaline and heart rate stuff and adrenaline, norepinephrine, stuff like that. But the end product of the HPA cycle is cortisol, and that's what they think can be damaging, and it has a negative feedback loop built in. So when you recruit a stress response and you get cortisol into your body to like, cleave, energy, glucose, stuff like that, and then also ramp your body up to deal with the stressor, the negative feedback loop automatically kicks in where you have receptors in your brain that almost are a built-in brake to make sure you don't shoot over too much, because like I said, living in that state for too long is problematic, which is where this concept came out, which was allostatic overload. So allostatic load is almost like what they refer to as like the stress you can deal with, right? Like it's hard, it's challenging, whether that's like a tough workout or whether that's like something that's nerve wracking for you, like public speaking or whatever it is. That's like the optimal dose you're looking for. But if it keeps going over and over and you keep recruiting the same stress response, either like someone's working out too hard or someone's not able to calm down their brain, like they're constantly having like running thoughts and stuff like that, that's where you get into what they think is toxic stress or allostatic overload. So, the extreme wear and tear and stuff like that. And so you get into like these systems that show the global stuff. But I remember like giving this presentation. This was like this is like a collagen study, and they were showing almost the same thing, saying that like in the net 24 hours, collagen is degrading, right? Because you're damaging things and you're causing some stress that's causing breakdown. But in the long term, it rebounds up and you have synthesis. So it was interesting to see some of the correlates between, collagen stuff, which is where I kind of started my world of stress and thinking about like Achilles tendinopathies or whatever. But then also looking at some of this stuff, this is from a really cool review in 2017 by David Gray, I think it is. So like he showed the exact same thing, which is like you have this like short-term enhancement of a lot of neurological things. So synaptic transmission, long-term potentiation, and like preservation ability, which is in these very minutes to hours things is probably useful. If it goes too much too soon, like things like PTSD and stuff like that, that's obviously too much of a single dose is problematic. But most people have issues with chronic activation of the system over time. And so like they show how it's really good, but then you look at all the things that are negative on the other side, right? So these are negative influences of glucocorticoids on the brain and on the body with long-term exposure, so months and years and things like that. So days to month, chronically, and a loss of resilience. So synaptic function is reduced, long-term potentiation is affected. You can retain and learn things less is suggested in the literature. And then suppression of neurogenesis, which is a big thing, right? Neurogenesis being like the ability to grow and have new synapses be adapted and things like that. There's two categories of those like mechanisms, which is non-genomic mechanisms, which is more just like spine density, dendritic density, and stuff like that, and maybe like functional circuit activation. But then there's also genomic things, so like the ways that genes are expressed and turn on and off and things like that also change over time. So there's been studies that show that like circadian rhythm and some other stuff happens acutely with genes turning on and off by the day cycle. But then also that like exposures to stress activate these things. And if it's the optimal dose, you can turn on positive genes and, exercise stress and heat shock proteins and sauna and things like that. But then in the long term, those things can tip the other way and you can have problems with that. So, but this was like a super interesting study I read because it was showing like the same stuff that happens at the physical therapy world that I was living in. But then this is more like the long-term stuff, right? So loss of resilience, neurochemical distortion, impaired remodeling, and lack of recovery from stress. And I think like when I think about it conceptually, you have kind of two sides of the nervous system. You have the autonomic nervous system, you have the sympathetic side and parasympathetic side. I think a lot of the research shows mixed kind of adaptations to negative stress. But one of the bigger things they see is like sympathetic dominance, right? Or autonomic variability is lost. So somebody loses the ability to oscillate between, ramped up and ramped down. And so if you have somebody who's unable to shift parasympathetically, there's a lot of negative effects of that, right? There's negative effects on bone remodeling. There's negative effects on tendon remodeling and in the ability to clear out some of the fatigue and junk and stuff like that. And so I think that's probably something that happens way more than most people think about in terms of a clinical setting. I think there's so many times when people just can't recover between practices or can't recover between training bouts and stuff like that, or people are having a tough time day to day. And I think a lot of that comes down to the inability to keep that oscillation between ramped up and ramped down. I remember talking with my buddy Seth Oberst a long time ago about like how heart rate variability is a really good index of autonomic function and stuff like that. And a higher heart rate variability is sometimes where people get like looking at some of the statistics and stuff like that. But I think that reflects the inability to have proper vagal tone with parasympathetic and sympathetic shifts. And I think that's where it becomes a little bit interesting because, the clinical manifest, you see people who are just like tired, right? Burnt out all the time, tired. They can't train as hard as they want. They're like pessimistic. Sometimes they have negative thought patterns. They're always like kind of like cranky here and there. But that might be a signal to the deeper stuff, which is again that like you're tipping into the end of this curve here, which is more like the the negative aspects of too much stress, right? So this paper was super interesting to me when I found it. And then I think there was one more that I was looking at. I think it was this one. Yeah. So this is really cool too, because I think this sums up a lot of the stuff that people consider stressful and things that you have chronic social and environmental stress, like in the paradigms of some of the rat research. The chronic social defeat stress is one of the things they test often because as humans that evolved in a social setting, social stress in terms of like they do it in like dominance hierarchies with rats and stuff like that. But social stress is a big one. Chronic unpredictable stress is another big paradigm they use quite a bit in this research, which is a variety of different things. Like I don't quote me on this, but I think it's like with shocks and swim tests and different like noises and stuff like that. It's just I think the unpredictable nature is something that they talk a lot about, right? The locus of control, the ability to be someone who understands what's coming next or not, or things of that nature. That's super, super well known in some of the things they test. But chronic social defeat stress and chronic unpredictable social stress, which I guess they would do those testings to kind of translate to, what kids grow up with tough environments or homes and things of that nature, or chronic stress in the workplace or things of that nature. I believe that's why they test some of those paradigms. But those are some of the most potent triggers for a stress response. So you have the chronic social, the environmental stuff. Social isolation is a big one, right? But then also physiological stressors with like metabolic stuff. That's like we think more about like workouts and stuff. Metabolic inflammation, which there's a lot of link to nutrition now. Like a lot of that research is coming out. I'm really not an expert in nutrition, but reading a lot of the modern Western diet and stuff like that people are concerned about, I think has to do with morely with systemic inflammation and leaky gut stuff, and cytokines have now kind of been shown to be able to cross the blood-brain barrier. So I think a lot of people are getting more evolving research in what that does for neuroinflammation and stuff like that, which is super interesting. Circadian disruptions, a big one. So they like study night shift workers, people who can't get a normal circadian rhythm with their super chiasmic nucleus, I think it's called. So it's like where your body governs like the clock genes, the on and off. So if you disrupt like your sleep wake cycles with like your job or with like whatever else you're doing, that's been a big suggester of something that's more contributed as a factor that goes into chronic stress. And then as we all have, chronic life stressors, major events, obviously we're in coronavirus and that's quite a potent factor for most people. But, when somebody passes away or you have a divorce or stuff like that, like these are all events that all pull from the same bucket, which is super interesting, right? Like the life events you have could be just as contributive, if that's a word, to like some of the hard workout you're doing, which can be contributing also with some of the chronic social stress you're having. Like all those things add up in a bucket and they pull from the same reservoir of like how much percentage you have in a day. So it's interesting to see how these things all tie together. And that's why I really got interested in it first, because I found that like it was interesting to watch some of the things that were happening in the world of gymnastics and some of the world of elite athletics that I was starting to treat patients for. And you can see how outside factors make such a big difference on someone's training or on someone's ability to recover from an injury and stuff like that. And so I remember like initially when I started reading this stuff, people were very confused of why, but I think there's more to it than most people think on a holistic point of view. And I think there's way more ways that we can affect it on a day-to-day level as, coaches, providers, friends, parents, whatever it is, than people realize. So they have these three major categories, and there's obviously always going to be genetic vulnerabilities. And I think that's an emerging part of the epigenetics world, which is, your genes don't dictate exactly what happens in your life, but nor does the environment rule everything. There's a lot of like interaction between genes and environment. So the susceptibility of someone who has the serotonin, I think it's the 5-HTT gene, is one of the more ones studied for depression. And they have ones related to, there's like the warrior gene that came out for a while. And Robert Sapolsky has done a lot of great work in his book to explain these things. But a lot of these things are the presence of a genetic risk factor, but also the presence of the environment to trigger those things to kind of have the genes turned on and off. And so I think there's a lot of interesting work that's being developed in how you can have a genetic variability or genetic predisposition, but very much the choices you make, the things you do, how you take care of yourself physically and mentally can influence the expression of those genes being turned on and turned off, which is where the field of epigenetics has become so popular. And stress is because they're able to now find different, factors that turn these things on or off. So, what you do, how much you sleep, the food you eat, how much you work out, your social support, like your ability to have a coping outlet, all that kind of stuff physically and mentally can influence how these genes are turned on and off. And it's super interesting for me to see because, hello, Fabio. Nice to see you from Italy. Good to see you. It's interesting to see how many people like can actually make a big difference on, the way they're shaped and stuff like that. I think that was fascinating for me is neuroplasticity was like the big buzzword for so long, but to think that, for me, I was thinking about like, man, as a coach or as someone who's influencing young athletes, the way that I talk to them, the way that I kind of hold myself and the things that we do can directly possibly influence the way that their brain architecture changes and the way their genes are transcribed and influences like functional learning capacity and, your ability to tolerate stresses down the road. Like that's what sports are for. Sports very much teach the life lessons, the habits, the practice, stuff like that, that might be useful down the road in those situations. So it was interesting to see, or is interesting and terrifying to think about, good or bad, how much influence people have on each other, especially from like a neurological remodeling point of view, but then also like a epigenetic transmission. There's been studies that show that like between generations, you can have influences of epigenetic changes from parents to kids to grandparents or whatever it is. But you can also very much do that yourself with the choices that you make and stuff like that. And so this study was one of the earlier ones that I think I remember reading and being really very, very interested in. And this is kind of the feedback mechanism that I was talking about. So there's, when you have a stress response, it's perceived by your brain. You have your amygdala is kind of like the fear center, as they say, but that's very much picking up. Hello, Michaela. How are you? Greetings from the Netherlands. It's great to talk about it. Yeah, I'm just randomly thinking about the things that I think are interesting. So good to have you here. So when you have a stress response, right, you have perception of stress is very much like what's buzzworthy in a lot of literature because your brain is like a processing unit, and some people find things some stressful, some things are not as stressful to other people, and so your amygdala very much has a record, and your memory as well as your hippocampus tags these things that are maybe triggers or very like worrisome for you. And so when that happens, there's like top down, but there's also bottom up, right? So bottom up being you can have signals from your body with interoception that's like, you're working out really hard and the acidity in your blood is through the roof, and that causes you to be a little bit more freaking out about, how hard the workout is or stuff like that. Like obviously the more dramatic stuff is like you have signals of pain, right? Or like you get a cut and stuff like that, and that recruits a stress response. So I view those as, I don't know if that's what the research suggests, but I view those as like bottom up, which is like signals from the periphery or from your tissues that are saying danger, or this is too hard, or you need to sit down or stuff like that, and that very much can recruit the stress response. But then also you can have it from more of a top down stress response point of view, which is like I mentioned earlier, is thinking about super stressful things, right? So thinking about finances and relationships and a big presentation you have, or something that's terrifying to you that's coming up down the road. I think those things are very much what humans are known for, to be able to kind of recruit the stress response and in a good way get yourself ready for it. But it's also the source of a lot of anxiety for people too, for things that paralyze them or whatever it is. So I find that super interesting. But the top down model and the bottom up recruits a stress response either way. It's subconscious mostly, but it's perceived by your cortex and obviously your amygdala. The basolateral amygdala is like the fear learning center, they call it, which is responsible for a lot of like conditioning, fear conditioning. So repeated exposures to a scary thing like touching hot plates when you're young or stuff like that, or injuries and things like that, it might condition you to be more worrisome about that. It's how we learn ourselves through it. But long story short is that once you have that fear perception, you have the release, as you can see on the graph over here, of corticotropin releasing factor. So they have the pituitary, and ATCH is kind of the main one, right? Which is adrenocorticotropin hormone, right? And that happens via corticotropin releasing factor from what's called the paraventricular nucleus. So like there's a cascade there. It's really not super important to think about it, but CRH, right, or CRF through the pituitary eventually ends in two systems being activated together. One of them is earlier, usually it's like the short-term quick twitch response, which is the ANS, or the autonomic nervous system, many people are familiar with, through the sympathetic medullary cycle, which is like the epinephrine, the norepinephrine, the blood pressure, stuff like that. So the SAM system, pronounce it right, sympathomedullary pathway. Yeah, that's what ultimately ends up in that like very fast, like jump yourself through your skin kind of heart rate, blood pressure, respiratory rate. There's like one branch that's more on like the adrenaline, the noradrenaline, stuff like that. And then there's another side of it, which is the HPA axis, right? Which is the hypothalamic axis, which most people are, hypothalamic pituitary axis, which most people are familiar with. The end product of that is glucocorticoids or cortisol, right? Most people know it's corticosteroids and corticoster. It's called corticosterone in rats. Could be wrong on that, but I believe it is. And like that kind of ends up right. So you have like the epinephrine, adrenaline side, which pumps down like the adrenaline, the heart rate, the blood pressure, the glucose cleaving, all that kind of stuff. And then you have more of the hypothalamic, longer term, slower, response, which is cortisol, which has its other massive effects for recruiting the glucose you need and stuff like that. But as you can see kind of up here, right, there's these receptors in your brain called glucocorticoid receptors. There's another one called mineralocorticoid receptors, but those are in your brain through like your prefrontal cortex, your amygdala, some other areas. And those are like the negative feedback things that I was talking about before. So as soon as you actually recruit that stress response, there's immediately something built in your body to shut it off, to not overshoot, which again goes back to allostatic load and like, good stress versus like the toxic stress, which is too much, right? They describe in the research the good stress or tolerable, good stress is like a healthy dose of exercise, right? Or a presentation that's hard, but you can get used to it. Like you want to be a public speaker, but you're nervous. You can't really stand in front of people. You do very slow exposures of learning more and more, and that's like good stress. It helps you. It's scary. It's stressful, but over time, you actually get better at it, and your body tolerates. That's the optimal dose to kind of climb you up that ladder. Then there's like tolerable stress, which they talk about, which is like something that's very, very hard for you, like really hard to overcome. Like they talk about some like really big, like big injuries or big stressful situations that really throw you for a loop. It's like really hard. You can handle it and you can adapt for it, but it's not necessarily healthy in the long term, right? You wouldn't want to be dealing with chronic life stress and like major events that are terrible back to back all the time, because that could be problematic. And then there's toxic stress, which is pushes you past your limit and it causes negative effects on your body. So those three things happen. But back to what I was talking about is like you have your stress response. It goes through that cascade. It recruits, adrenaline from the cortex of your adrenals and things of that nature. And then also you have the end of cortisol, but there's an immediate negative feedback loop to prevent the allostatic overload. And so you can have things that are, non-genomic, like I was saying, which is like the different effects that are not as long-term in nature, right? And I remember I was reading a paper yesterday, maybe a book. It was talking about how like long-term potentiation for memory has 3 stages. So there's like the immediate short-term effect, which has to do more locally. And there's like a longer-term kind of like mRNA transcription factors that your genes change for longer-term changes. The more you learn something, the more you repeat a practice, the more you do things over and over, you long-term potentiate with gene changes, versus the short-term stuff might be more related to growth factors and excitatory transmission of glutamate and stuff like that. So it's interesting for me to see the different types of changes that your body has built in line, which is like the short-term stuff or the long-term stuff. But both are very much super important for it. And I think that people, I know I find it really interesting, and I think it's really not worth like talking for like a lot of it, but it's fascinating to me. It really is. Like I do this stuff for fun. Like my spare time is reading about some of the stuff, because I find it's like massively curious for myself in my own like life, how I approach things, but then also for how other people handle stress and stuff like that. And when you think about all the way dosing exercise, if you're a PT or something like that, or you think about, trying to help somebody get through a long-term injury and like manage their career and stuff like that. So this paper has some really good stuff. I think this is Bruce McEwen, unfortunately, just passed away. And funny story, when I was down in New York for a lecture, I went to Rockefeller and tried to find him, but it was unable to happen because he was away. But I tried. But these are genomic effects and non-genomic effects, and I think there might have been one more interesting thing to see here. Yeah, so this is a super interesting point too. It's I remember talking to Tim Gabbett about this, but like there's an inverted U curve for activity of your sympathetic nervous system and parasympathetic, because of what I just talked about with like the toxic effect long term. Short term, it's really good, and you should have hard training, and you should be able to push yourself and do things that are spooky and scary and make your stomach turn a little bit. But in the long term, the negative feedback, the negative damage through excitotoxic mechanisms or other stuff is problematic. And so you can see on a molecular level, a submolecular level, with gene transcription on and off, that's evident. But then also you can see it with cortisol, right, at a hormone level. But then you can also see it at a more global level with the systems, but then you can see it at a more global level with workloads. And I think it's super interesting to see how the global workload research inverted U curves sometimes are representative, like, not working out and not training hard enough is problematic. There's a sweet spot. And then it dips back the other way where spiking your training volume and going too much too soon is also problematic. And so that's also what this kind of stuff says, is that in that, you know, optimal dose in the middle, right? Optimal HPA activity in the middle. If it's too low, you won't get the effect you want. But if it's too high, or if the frequency goes too high, you can also have a problem with that as well. So it's super weird. I mean, super interesting to see the short term. You have positive things. You have more synaptic function. You have more neuroplastic changes, and you have enhanced learning. Your hippocampus and your emotional center, your limbic system tags. You can remember highly emotional events, good or bad, more because there's emotional tagging with those systems related to your memories. And so if you have some sort of like, nerves or fear or stuff like that, or if it's a big deal, you're probably going to remember that more. And that's actually a good thing, right? You want to remember. In the old days, the evolution days, it was, you want to remember where those poisonous berries were. You want to remember where like the tigers live. You want to remember all like the scary stuff is, so you don't go back there. But in our real world today, that stuff matters too, in terms of like, decisions you make and things you do for your safety, or what makes you feel good versus what makes you feel bad. But that system is very much still evident, in terms of tagging and stuff like that. So you have that like optimal dose in the middle, but then as you get on this side of the curve, which is the opposite, right? Either, like I said, too hard of a spike, like you really, like, something traumatic happens and you secrete a ton of glucocorticoids and you're really stressed out by it, or you have chronic activation, right? Low level chronic activation of your HPA system and your SAM system, can be problematic. So you see reduced synaptic function, you see impaired neuroplasticity, which is where I started to get concerning about like chronic stress in different training environments with all sorts of high pressure stakes or whatever it is. If it's not handled well, with reducing synaptic function and reducing learning capacity, and that is very worrisome in terms of kids for sure. So the ability to learn things in school, learn new stuff in sports, to just have a healthy, thriving brain and things of that nature. And then as you get like way, way, way down the end of the spectrum, starts to become like issues with possible neural damage from excitotoxicity, which is one of the main mechanisms. Maybe there's one more. Yeah, I don't think so, but that was one paper that was super interesting. I brought this one up too, kind of going back to how stress impacts like certain areas, but there's three main reasons they typically look at, or three main regions they talk about. So the hippocampus, like memory, right? Amygdala, like emotional fear stuff. Prefrontal cortex being like what your decision making and your rational thought process comes from. And so I remember reading about how there's like very important receptors, right? These glucocorticoids and mineralocorticoid receptors that are in your brain, and they kind of are the feedback loop. And so you have these feedback loops from HPA, and the acute versus chronic stuff is very region dependent. It's just interesting, right? There's region specific changes they see with different areas based on chronic stress or not. So in the amygdala, and I think this was in PTSD research and some other places, but chronic stress and maybe anxiety in the short term, it might be helpful to make sure you're staying safe, but long term, they actually see an increase, in some cases, an increase in amygdala activity, which is like the fear center and stuff like that, versus in the prefrontal cortex, which is very much the like planning, the thought reasoning, the rational part of your brain. The higher cortical powers, those have a reduced activity over time, and there's a lot of different things that can reduce prefrontal cortex ability. Alcohol and drugs, they've studied that quite a bit, but there's a lot of other things that are shown to reduce it. And the more there's a loop between your prefrontal cortex and your amygdala to help kind of balance back and forth. You need them both. There's like a famous book that talks about the elephant and the rider, right? The elephant being like the crazy limbic brain that's like driving a car all over the place, versus your prefrontal cortex, which is more like your thinking side of stuff, which is more your rational thought. And so you tune the ability to like think and control your actions and stuff like that with more experience and with more exposures. And I think Walter Marshall was the most famous for doing some of these things in the prefrontal cortex with delayed gratification in kids, like the marshmallow test. There's an experiment where they, look at what kids can delay their ability to like, eat all the marshmallows in a short period of time versus those that can, think down the road. They say like, oh, I'll give you one marshmallow now, or like three down the road or something like that. And they follow these kids. I think this was Stanford. They follow these kids like all the way down 10 years later. And the ones that had better delayed gratification were able to have higher outcomes positively with life. But that spoke to a lot of the circuitry behind, the limbic system, which is sometimes the fear center, but also the ventral tegmentum and the nucleus accumbens, which is more like the dopamine centers and the motivation, the reward center, stuff like that. There's, studies with food and with alcohol and with drugs, stuff like that, which is very much how the pursuit of something like that and novelty is where dopamine kind of comes into play. But then also that the actual thing you get is very much dopamine driven. So the ability of the prefrontal cortex, and there's different parts of it that I'm not an expert in this stuff, just, off top of my head, but the ventral medial cortex and the dorsal lateral cortex, I think are talked about quite a bit in terms of being able to kind of have regulatory control and modulatory control over the VTA, the NAC, so the ventral tegmentum, the nucleus accumbens loop, and then also the amygdala stuff to kind of control some of those limbic fear-based emotions when everybody knows there's stuff that they want to do, but it's spooky, right? So there's the ability to override that and know and see in the prediction for the long term that there's going to be something good that comes out of it. So it's interesting to see like some of the work in delayed gratification and also see how, different choices, habits tune the neural circuitry behind the fear loop of either prefrontal cortex and amygdala and like stress responses, but then also the side of ventral tegmentum, the nucleus accumbens, and like that kind of stuff to delay gratification for instant rewards, like everything from smartphones to junk food and stuff like that. But this was a super interesting piece of this study, which talked about how things change with chronic stress, right? So with the prefrontal cortex, chronic stress causes medial PFC neurons to show debranching and shrinkage of dendrites that associate with cognitive rigidity, while orbital frontal cortex neurons expand dendritic that might be increased vigilance, right? So changes in the prefrontal cortex with chronic stress, which is, again, like they say down here, decision-making, memory, mood, impulsive behavior. Those changes long-term with chronic stress, have been shown in some instances as a massive body of research, but, dendritic shrinking and stuff like that, that's problematic. That's not very good, right? But then you have other areas such as the amygdala up here, that acute traumatic stressors were found to increase spine density on the basolateral amygdala neurons, again, which is the fear conditioning center. And then chronic stress leads to expansion of the basolateral amygdala dendrites, right? So not necessarily a good thing long term, because you don't want to have someone who's hyper reactive to fear responses, or they find people who have conditioned responses to interpret neutral threats in the environment as more fearful. So over time, they might misinterpret things that are not as dangerous or not as problematic, and they get anxiety or stuff like that. But again, that goes back to chronically recruiting the stress response. And as it comes to athletes and stuff, it's interesting because I've seen some really high level athletes who are able to kind of funnel that stress response, that fear response in the beginning, and they can put that into a positive tunnel, right? They know it's part of why they're competing, and they know they're able to keep their heart rate down, keep their adrenaline down, keep their self in control, and they're not going to burn themselves out too fast when they compete or stuff like that. I think it's interesting that they say it's not the stress that kills you, it's how you respond to it. And so those that are able to kind of harness that tend to do well versus those that it lets them get the best of them or they go too crazy. Again, all about that optimal dose. This is another one that looks at amounts and frequency similar to the last paper, but kind of looking at the optimal dose of, on this side, there's that synaptic transmission is good, enhanced, but then as you get higher, synaptic function suppresses, adaptive plasticity suppresses a little bit, neurogenesis and remodeling is reduced, the loss of resilience is kind of evident. There's risk factors for susceptibility versus resilience, someone who can like develop a way to kind of cope with those things in a healthy way. And then damage protection, excitotoxicity, brain aging, like not great things in the long term. There was one more thing that was super interesting. I can't remember if it was here. Yeah, these are some of the molecular mechanisms behind epigenetics, kind of the biggest ones that they're studying now. So like, your histones are wrapped up in these 8 groups or these 4 groups. There's a whole bunch of different stuff, but there's different effects that turn your genes on and off. And I took a course in this online from a place in Australia, which was online for free. It was super interesting, but the DNA itself is wrapped up, and there's ways to turn on or turn off certain genes. So DNA methylation is one of the bigger ones that's known right now, but there's also histone modifications. And there are also things like microRNAs that are making a big difference on on and off. And I'm lying to anyone saying that I'm really an expert in this. It's just stuff that I've been interested in. So, different actions, choices, reactions can change some of these DNA changes and outputs, which is where I was reading about like phosphorylation effects of proteins today in a neurochemistry textbook and how that underpins a lot of the different stuff that happens in our body for learning and memory and synaptic transmission. And so these things are happening at like a blistering pace in our body, and it's mind blowing to think about. But these are very much the genomic side of things, which is where, above, I think it was maybe in this one here, it was the other one that I was looking at, but they said like the genomic and the non-genomic effects of some of this stuff comes from, different mechanisms, but the genomic side, there's a lot of them, but these are some of the more prominent ones right now. Histone acetylation, phosphorylation, methylation, DNA methylation, microRNAs, long coding RNAs are there. But these things are very much the nitty gritty molecular mechanisms that change people's in response to stress. So how you adapt to things over time, which was, it's a monstrous topic for itself. But if people are interested in it, this is the textbook that I read on it, or I can read all of it, but a good chunk of it. But this is super interesting. This has got a lot of the epigenetics by Alis. I doubt that anybody is interested in this kind of stuff, but don't judge my highlighting. But it goes over some of the histone modifications and the way that, phosphorylation, and it's not that it's, this is more for like geneticists and stuff like that, but it was interesting to me to read a bunch of these chapters and studies to see how these things occur, in the different ways that, the body turns on and turns off certain things in response to stress. And so I wouldn't say I use that a lot in my daily life, but it's really interesting to kind of know from the back end. And then there are some really interesting textbooks that I would recommend if people are, and so like Robert Sapolsky's book, Why Zebras Don't Get Ulcers, is like a broad overview. But it's not really like the nitty gritty stuff. There's this book is phenomenal, Stress Resilience, which just came out. It's super thick. In terms of dense, not thick, but density. Alan Chain wrote this one or edited this one. And it has a lot of really, really cool, interesting research. And then my goal by the end of quarantine is to finish up these ones I've read. So this is George Fink's volumes, if you're into stuff. So this is volume 1. Yeah. This is volume 1, which is kind of like the background type stuff. A lot of really good chapters in that. And I'm going back through to try to finish it. This is volume 2, which is more like biochemistry, pathology. Is this 2? This is 3. Sorry. This is volume 2. This is volume 2, which is stress, neuroendocrinology, and neurobiology. This is more of like the nitty gritty stuff related to specific mechanisms for certain stuff. There are a ton of different really interesting chapters in here. And this covers a lot of the genetic stuff that I was talking about before, but this is more like the hormonal stuff, endocrinological stuff, and different things related to epigenetics like I was talking about. But that's volume 2. And then this is volume 3, which is like pathology and stuff like that. This talks about more the end result. So if you are into, I can't believe that this many people actually listened for so long, but this is the stuff that I find really interesting. I'm considering doing a PhD in this kind of stuff down the road if I ever get my life together and figure out what I want to do. But those are very good. Anything by Robert Sapolsky in the text world is good. Bruce McEwen is a monster. He has, what I actually should share? He has a phenomenal lecture on YouTube that I never got around to posting before he passed away. He did an online, yeah, here it is. So if you guys really want to see something that's kind of got me interested from Cornell, he goes through super interesting stuff. I'll share it right here. He goes through really interesting stuff. This lecture is The Resilient Brain, Epigenetic Stress, and the Life Course. And I've watched this lecture probably 12 times. I just used to like listen to it while I was running over and over, but he's absolutely brilliant. And he wrote a lot of these articles that I was just talking about, but this stuff goes through a lot of the really interesting research that's being done up to this point. I think his doctoral fellows are David Gray and some other people, I'm not sure. But I highly suggest that people, if they like this stuff, just start with some of those papers and also start of just exploring some of the world. But that's a really good lecture. And I will put it in the comment section so people have it. Oh, geez, that wasn't right. There it is. Yeah, so if you guys are interested, that is a phenomenal listen, especially in quarantine if you have some extra time on your hands. Um, that one is very good. And then, yeah, I think that the other really interesting thing to kind of consider is like the how you can moderate or mediate some of the stressors. Like it's crazy to think about when they look at some of the things that are buffering of chronic stress and that are helpful. Like sleep is a big one, exercise is a big one. Um, Social support is very interesting because it can be a cause or a generator of stress, or it can be a moderator, right? If I just think about people who hang out with not the best people, and it's probably a source of their toxic stress, versus people who have great friends and great family, and it's very much an alleviator of their stress because they can get stuff off their mind, or they can kind of air out some of the things that are tough. And I think in all some way, shape, or form, people have that stuff. We're social creatures. Like obviously now with coronavirus, it's in FaceTime form or whatever it is. But yeah, that's a really interesting part of this research that is shown is how the different stress responses can be modulated by good or bad things, right? In terms of social support or sleeping enough or having a job you actually like or not working too much or working what's perfect for you. A lot of stuff um, links back to purpose and like satisfaction of job and stuff like that. That's a big one. Um, and then also they talk a lot about how some people can perceive two stressors as very different. So, two people going out and running 5 miles, one person who hates running and one person who runs marathons, the perception of that stress and the worry about what's going to happen could be just as concerning as someone who's not. Somebody might have a very different stress response, and you could give the same load to two people, and one would fall apart, and one would be like, that was a piece of cake. Um, so that's pretty interesting. But I think that these papers were kind of what started me off on it. And then this is a really good study too. I'll probably just end with this one because I got to get to another meeting. But this is a really cool study that reviewed all the biomarkers of allostatic load, but it has a really good summary of the types of stuff that go on. Let's see if I can zoom in here. Yeah, so really good definitions and stuff like that. But they dive in really well to how the model evolved, and I think this is kind of where I got the most. So allostatic load represents wear and tear of the body experienced when repetitive allostatic responses are activated during stressful situations. They real or interpreted threats to homeostasis initiate the SAM axis release of catecholamines and the HPA axis recourse of glucocorticoids that mobilize energy. Coordination therefore depends on the brain's evaluation of threat, which is very interesting that it all comes through one perception system. Um, yeah, this is the interesting part. While adaptive acutely, chronic overactivation of the SAM and HPA axis products induce a domino effect on interconnected biological systems that overcompensate and eventually collapse on themselves, leaving the organism susceptible to stress-related diseases. And then again, they talk about some of the stuff that I mentioned in the things below, but brain-associated changes with chronic stress, synaptic and dendritic remodeling, suppress neurogenesis, structural atrophy or hypertrophy. Again, it's region-specific, like the amygdala may be hypertrophy, which might not be a good thing in the long term, but then like prefrontal cortex might be atrophied a little bit, which is also not good. Further diminishes the body's ability to cognitively process and physiologically respond to stressors. These contribute to the pathophysiological allostatic states that reflect response patterns which allostatic systems are overactive and dysregulated, which is overtraining, right? That's a classic overtraining when someone's, non-functionally overreached and is having it and they're in a bad mood and stuff like that. So these processes are rooted in biopsychosocial antecedents integrated with the AL model that postulates sequential chain of dysregulation in multiple systems. And this is very similar to what they showed before, but I think this is this is cool. So these are like the markers that they're starting to use now. So stress hormones and their agonists in conjunction with pro and anti-inflammatory cytokines, IL-6, tumor necrosis factor, alpha, represent the AL biomarkers used as primary mediators, which is something I'm reading a lot about now about how they test for these kind of stuff. Synergistic effects of these molecules exert primary effects on cellular activities, enzymes, receptors, and ion channels and genomic changes that compromise the physiological integrity of allostatic mechanisms. So all these systems kind of get taxed and strained, and they become secondary outcomes, which is where they start to look at more like disease processes of metabolic stuff. This would be injuries or overuse, tissue breakdown in some of the PT medical world. Insulin, glucose, cholesterol. Start to look at cardiovascular stuff, such as blood pressure, and then also immune function with C-reactive protein and fibrogen. And then lastly, the final stage of progression is allostatic overload, whereby the accumulation of physiological dysregulations leads to disordered disease and decreased endpoints referred to as tertiary outcomes. So this paper is very interesting, and I think it's open access. Let me check that real quick. I'll put it in the links here, but I think this paper is open access. I could be wrong on that one. Chronic stress and impacts. This one is not. I must have gotten that from a library loan, but I know for a fact that the other one that I showed, which is this one, I believe this one is open access. Yeah. Let me see here. Isn't the stress in the brain? Yeah, so this one's open access. I will put this one in the chat. Can't believe there's actually people here listening to this rant. That one's real good. And then there was one more. That one is not. But I think there might have been one more that is access. Yeah, this one's more of like a lay kind of an overview, but this one is also open access. So read those they can. So scoot, but yeah, there it is, man. That's stress stuff. I think in the future, I'll research more papers and we'll keep doing this. If people find it interesting, we'll talk about the applications and whatever else. But for now, I hope that was an hour of geeky time for you. Stay safe, everybody.